My stepfather hated me for years until he discovered my mom lied and blamed me to keep his dying mother out. So, I'm 16, still in high school, and my mom married my stepdad, Elliot, 2 years back. She's 40, he's 42. My biological parents were never married. My existence is the result of a brief fling they had right after college. They figured it was just a short-term thing, something that would fizzle out in a few months, but then my mom found out she was pregnant. She decided to keep me, and my dad wanted to be involved, so they agreed on shared custody. Ever since I was a kid, I've spent alternating months at each of their homes, splitting my time equally between them. I love both my parents, and I know they've sacrificed a lot just to make sure they could always be close to me. The biggest and most obvious one? They both stayed in the same city for years so I wouldn't have to deal with long commutes between their houses. I only learned about that recently, but apparently, they each passed up multiple career opportunities just so they wouldn't have to move away. They put their own ambitions on hold for me. And my mom? She gave up even more. From what I've been told, she had to turn down quite a few men who were really into her, all because she wanted to focus on raising me. Marriage, a husband, trying to balance a relationship with work and parenting, it was all too much, so she just avoided it altogether. And you know how I found all this out? Indirectly, through Elliot. Because, as it turns out, he's not exactly the best stepfather in the world. My mom had to tell me all this as a way to convince me to accept him. Her reasoning? If she could make all these sacrifices for me, then the least I could do was make a small one in return by giving Elliot a chance. I don't really see how that logic works, though. I mean, I never asked her to make those sacrifices. She could have ended the pregnancy, or she could have let my dad raise me full-time. But I never argued with her about it. I love my mom, and I want her to be happy, so I was willing to be open to Elliot even though, from the start, he wasn't exactly friendly. Now, when I say he's not nice, I don't mean that he's mean or rude to me. It's actually the opposite, he just straight up ignores me. It's like I don't exist. And I have no clue why. I have never done anything to piss him off. In fact, I've always made an effort to be polite because that's how I was raised, to be respectful, even when people clearly don't like you. But Elliot? He took things to a whole new level. He doesn't say anything rude, doesn't make snide comments, he just doesn't acknowledge me at all. This has been going on for 3 years now. One day, he was normal, making conversation, asking me questions about my life. And then, suddenly, he just stopped. No warning, no reason, just decided he wasn't going to talk to me anymore. It's honestly the weirdest thing. It's like he's giving me the cold shoulder, but I have no idea what I did to deserve it. And since I don't know what the issue is, I can't even fix it. When I asked my mom about it, she brushed it off, saying that's just the way he is. That he doesn't dislike me, but he doesn't necessarily like me either. Which, honestly, makes no sense to me. If you don't like someone, shouldn't there be a reason? Especially when you're a grown man in your 40s and the person you're weirdly avoiding is a 16-year-old? Maybe it's some kind of step-parent dynamic, or maybe it's because I'm my mom's first kid, who knows? The whole thing feels random, especially since, in the beginning, we were fine. When he first started coming around, he was friendly, curious, and actually talked to me. Then, out of nowhere, he just flipped a switch and started pretending I wasn't even in the room. At first, I thought maybe he was just distracted, forgot to say hi or something. But then it happened again. And again. To the point where it was impossible to ignore. Eventually, I asked my mom straight up if I had done something to upset him. Because every time I walked into a room, he'd literally turn his head away like I wasn't there. She gave me some vague explanation about how he was just adjusting to the idea of me being around all the time. That he'd only ever dated women without kids before, and maybe it was just new to him. But that didn't add up. He had 2 kids of his own, 2 sons, 15 and 12. Their mom passed away in an accident after the younger one was born. And besides, I wasn't even around all the time. I spent half the year living at my dad's place, so it's not like I was some permanent fixture in his life. Still, after a few months of this, I just gave up trying to figure him out. I accepted that this was just how things were going to be. Elliot wasn't going to speak to me, and I had no choice but to live with it. After dating for a year, Elliot proposed to my mom, and a few months later, they got married. That's when he and his kids moved into our house. Before that, I had only met his sons a couple of times, and even back then, it was clear they had been taught not to speak to me. The whole thing was bizarre, and looking back, I honestly don't know how I put up with it for so long, for years, actually. Before the wedding, Elliot and my mom lived separately because he was taking care of his sick mother. She had been living with him, but once he and my mom got married, he arranged for his sister to take over so he could move in with us. And just like that, our house went from a place where I lived with my mom to a place where I was surrounded by people who acted like I didn't exist. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that, but let me tell you, it's not easy. Being ignored, day in and day out, by the people you share a home with? It messes with you. It made me feel like I had done something terrible, like I was some kind of criminal who deserved to be shunned. The worst part? I never got an explanation. To this day, I have no clue what I did to deserve that treatment. But at least I don't have to live with them anymore, so I guess it doesn't really matter now. As time went on, nothing changed. I was already used to Elliot ignoring me whenever he came over to visit my mom, and after they got married, I just got used to the same treatment from his kids too. Every time I stayed at my mom's place, I had to mentally prepare myself for 2 weeks of barely talking to anyone but her. She was the only person in that house who acknowledged me. Everyone else acted like I was invisible. It hurt, but I put up with it because I wanted to spend time with my mom. And I knew she wasn't going to do anything about it. Believe me, I tried so many times to get her to talk to Elliot and figure out why he was like this. But she always shut me down. She said she had already spoken to him, that there were personal reasons she couldn't tell me about, and that was why he refused to acknowledge me. And that was that. She understood that it hurt me, but she also understood where he was coming from, so I just had to suck it up and deal with it. If I ever tried to push back, she'd get emotional and start telling me I was being ungrateful. She'd remind me of all the sacrifices she had made for me, as if that meant I should just accept Elliot's behavior without complaint. Like I owed her this. I wanted to argue, to stand up for myself, but I didn't want to hurt her feelings. So I kept quiet. I never even told my dad about any of this, because I knew he'd be furious. My parents had always had their differences when it came to raising me, and they fought often enough as it was. But if he found out about something this big? It would have been a disaster. He probably would have tried to get full custody or something drastic like that, and I didn't want to start that kind of drama. So I stayed quiet, acted like everything was fine, and just dealt with it. Elliot and my mom had been together for a year before they got married, and now they'd been living together for 2 years. That meant I had been putting up with this silent treatment for 3 years. 3 years of being ignored in my own home. And honestly, I had reached my limit. The breaking point came last month. I was supposed to be staying at my mom's house for the month, and as usual, Elliot and his kids were pretending I didn't exist. I was already having a rough time, things weren't great at school, I had been fighting with a couple of my friends, and I wasn't in the best headspace. So when I woke up one morning and realized the house was completely empty, I just lost it. The night before, everything had been normal, or as normal as it ever got in that house. They were all talking to each other, ignoring me, business as usual. But no one had mentioned anything about going anywhere. Then the next morning, I woke up to an empty house. I had no idea where they were, so I called my mom. Thankfully, she picked up. When I asked her what was going on, she casually told me that she, Elliot, and the kids had gone on a little trip for the week and that I was supposed to stay home and watch the house. I was stunned. She hadn't told me about this. No one had. They had all just packed up and left, without so much as a heads up. And now, she expected me to stay home alone and babysit the house? Sure, I was on summer break, so I didn't have school, but that wasn't the point. I wasn't okay with being left behind like this. If she was that worried about the house, she could have just installed better security instead of tricking me into staying home. But more than that, I was just hurt. Not only had they excluded me from their trip, but they hadn't even bothered to mention it. If they had at least told me in advance, I probably wouldn't have cared. Honestly, I might have even been fine with it. What high school guy wouldn't want an empty house to himself for a few days? I could have invited a couple of friends over and made the most of it. But I wasn't in the mood for that anymore. My mom's actions had already ruined it. I felt like she didn't even consider me part of the family, and on top of that, I was already dealing with issues at school. I had no one to invite over anyway. So there I was alone, abandoned, and feeling like absolute crap. And that was the moment I realized I was done. I wasn't going to put up with this anymore. I told my mother straight up she owed me an apology. I could accept that Elliot didn't like talking to me, but the least they could have done was tell me they were leaving. Waking up to an empty house with no warning? That wasn't right. But instead of seeing my point, she brushed it off. She said I was making a big deal out of nothing and that I needed to get over it. Before I could even respond, she hung up. When I tried calling her back, she ignored my calls. A few minutes later, I got a text from her saying she was trying to enjoy her trip and would talk to me once they got to the hotel. That was it for me. I was done. I didn't care that leaving meant the house would be completely empty. I wasn't about to sit around like some guard dog just because my mother decided to take off without so much as a heads up. I tried calling her again to let her know I was leaving, but, of course, straight to voicemail. So I locked up, placed the house key under a potted plant like she usually did, and left. I went straight to my dad's place. When I walked in, he was surprised to see me back so early. He had expected me to stay with my mother until the end of the month. But I had reached my limit. I told him everything. I told him about Elliot and how he had trained his kids to ignore me, how I had spent years feeling like I had done something wrong without ever knowing what it was. I told him how my mother refused to do anything about it, how she always defended Elliot's personal reasons without ever telling me what they were. I explained how I had put up with it for so long, how I wanted my mother to be happy, how she always reminded me of the sacrifices she had made for me, making me feel like I owed her this. But this? This was too much. I was done tolerating it. And then, I told him about what had just happened. How my mother had left me home alone for a week without even telling me they were going anywhere. How she just expected me to be fine with it, to take care of the house like some unpaid caretaker. And the worst part, how she ignored my calls when I tried to talk to her, like I was nothing. By the time I finished, I broke down. I hadn't even realized how much this had been weighing on me for the past few years. My relationship with my mother used to be normal until Elliot came along. After that, everything changed. I felt like I didn't matter to her anymore, like I was just some afterthought. And that hurt more than anything. My father listened to everything, and when I was done, he just said one thing. "I'll take care of it." He was clearly upset, but he didn't go off or badmouth my mother to me. Instead, he just told me he was glad I had finally told him. That it was off my chest now. And that from this moment on, I was going to be living with him. If I ever wanted to go back to my mother's house, that would be my choice, but he didn't recommend it. So, I stayed. And you know what the funny part is? My mother never even tried to call me. Not once. She had left her son alone in that house while she went off with her new family, and she didn't even bother to check in on me. That stung. But after talking to my dad, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And I decided, right then and there, that I wasn't going to let this bother me anymore. For 5 days, there was nothing, no calls, no messages, no sign that my mother even cared where I was. And then, out of nowhere, she finally called. At first, I thought maybe she was going to check up on me, maybe even apologize. But the moment I picked up, she was already screaming. It took me a few seconds to even process what she was yelling about, but then I caught the words robbed, house, and, somehow, my fault. Apparently, while they were off on their trip, someone had broken into the house and stolen a bunch of expensive stuff, the TV, some electronics, other valuables. And for some insane reason, she was blaming me. I couldn't believe it. I reminded her that I had tried calling her to tell her I was leaving. I had made it very clear that I wasn't staying there. She was the one who ignored my calls.
That wasn't on me.
Once she finally stopped yelling, I told her exactly how I felt about the way she had been treating me. I reminded her that after she hung up on me that day, I had tried to call her back multiple times, but she refused to answer.
Her response? Well, you could have texted me. Sure, she had a point.
But I told her I hadn't done it on purpose. I was mad.
And after everything, it should have been obvious why.
I had made it perfectly clear that I was upset. She had no reason to expect me to stay in that house after what she pulled.
That set off another massive argument.
She was convinced that, no matter how angry or upset I was, I should have stayed because it was a matter of safety. That she had trusted me. That she had counted on me.
But I never asked for that responsibility.
In fact, I had done everything in my power to let her know I was leaving. She ignored me, so now she had to deal with the consequences.
That was on her, not me.
And then there was Elliot. After years of ignoring me, he finally spoke to me, and it was just to yell at me and blame me for my carelessness.
But that wasn't even the worst part. He said something that left me completely confused. I always knew you'd be the one to ruin us. Ruin what?
I had barely even spoken to the man.
We never interacted. Where was this coming from? And now, my parents were fighting over it.
My dad firmly believed this was all my mother's fault, and honestly, so did I. But she refused to take responsibility. Instead, she was demanding that my father pay for the damages.
Her reasoning?
If he was going to defend me, then he should be ready to pay the price for it. I had no idea what to do. She told me that the only way she'd drop this was if I apologized to her, to Elliot, to his kids.
I didn't want to. I hadn't done anything wrong.
But at the same time, I didn't want her to keep harassing my father over this.
Update.
It's been 2 weeks since the break-in, and a lot has come to light. For starters, I finally figured out why Elliot hated me so much. Apparently, back when he and my mom first started dating, he had asked if he could move in with us and bring his mother along, too. His mom was elderly and sick, but she had a full-time nurse. She just needed family around for emotional support.
My mother said no.
She wasn't comfortable moving in together so soon, and she definitely wasn't okay with the idea of taking on the extra responsibility of having Elliot's mother in the house. But instead of just being honest with him, she lied. She told him that she wanted to say yes, but she couldn't because of me.
This was only 3 months into their relationship.
Things were getting serious between them way too fast, but that was my mother's choice, not mine. What was my problem, though, was how she painted me in all of this. She told Elliot that I was the reason she hadn't been able to have a serious relationship in years. That I was possessive, that I drove men away because I still had this fantasy that she and my dad would get back together.
And then she really went for it.
She told him that I had called his mother a useless burden and that I had threatened to make her suffer if she ever moved in.
That I had referred to his kids as little evil goblins who would ruin our family. That wasn't just an exaggeration, that was a complete fabrication. I would never say something like that.
I know how cruel and insensitive that would be. But Elliot believed her. Even though I had never done or said anything remotely close to that, he just took her word for it.
And now I understood everything.
For years, I had been confused about why he treated me the way he did. Why his kids ignored me. Why I felt like a stranger in my own home. It was because, from the very beginning, my mother had poisoned him against me. And I only found out about it now because Elliot had been pushing her to cut me off completely.
He wanted her to disown me. To cut all ties.
He thought the break-in was the perfect excuse to finally be rid of me.
But my mother hesitated.
So, after all these years, she finally had to come clean.
And now, they're living separately.
Elliot couldn't believe that for years, he had been mistreating me over a bunch of lies my mother fed him just because she was too afraid to tell him the truth. That it was her who didn't want his sick mother living with us, not me. In the email he sent me, he admitted that if my mom had just been honest, if she had simply told him that she didn't have the emotional capacity to care for his mother, he would have understood. He would have worked something out with his sister so they could share the responsibility.
But instead, she chose to lie. And not just any lie, she made up this whole awful story about me, and he believed it.
He trusted her completely, so he never thought to question it. And because he and I never talked, he never got the chance to see the truth for himself.
That email was an apology.
He said he was sorry for everything he had put me through and hoped I could forgive him.
I haven't responded yet. Honestly, I don't know how to feel about any of this. I just want some time to clear my head.
But at least now, I finally understand why he treated me the way he did for so long and why my mother let it happen. In fact, it worked out perfectly for her. She had been feeding him lie after lie, telling him I was constantly getting into trouble at school. And because he never had a reason to doubt her, he never looked deeper. Meanwhile, I was just living my life, unaware that she had completely destroyed my reputation in my own home.
She is a twisted woman.
After learning all this, my father decided to file for full custody. My mother was devastated, claiming she loved us and just wanted us to be a happy family.
But I'm sorry, you don't get to create a happy family by tearing everyone else down. Update 2. Not only is my dad filing for full custody, but Elliot is also filing for divorce.
I found out because my mother sent my dad a bunch of desperate messages, begging him to talk to Elliot and fix things. She claims she can't live without all of us. I don't know how she even expects us to listen to her after everything she's done. She let me be mistreated for years, knowing full well that it was all based on lies.
She was completely fine with it until it backfired on her. I wouldn't wish this kind of betrayal on anyone. For years, I wondered what I had done wrong. Why Elliot and his family seemed to hate me for no reason.
Meanwhile, she just sat there, watching it happen, never once stepping in to tell the truth.
Well, I've made my decision.
I've blocked her everywhere.
I don't want to talk to her ever again. For so long, I put up with everything because I loved her. Because I wanted her to be happy. But she didn't feel the same way about me.
She only cared about herself. So that makes two of us, both of us put her happiness first.
Well, not anymore. Update 3. It's official.
Elliot has filed for divorce. And now, it's all anyone is talking about: our family, mutual friends, even distant relatives. My mother, meanwhile, has chosen to deal with it in the most ridiculous way possible. Instead of actually taking accountability, she's been posting sad, dramatic quotes on social media.
My cousins keep sending me screenshots.
I don't know what she expects, but one thing's for sure: that's not going to fix anything. She made her bed.
Now she has to lie in it. Update 4.
My dad officially has full custody of me. It took a couple of months, mostly because my mother put up a fight, but the divorce complicated things for her. And honestly, with all the proof of what she put me through, she never really stood a chance. Her lawyer managed to drag the case out for a while, but in the end, she lost.
Now, I don't have to visit her if I don't want to. My dad is my custodial parent.
She does have visitation rights, but I don't see the point.
I don't want to talk to her. I don't want anything to do with her. I'm finally happy. I'm living with my dad, and life is good.
I've even reconnected with my friends, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can finally move on.